In the early hours of a quiet September morning in 1666, London was asleep. The streets were narrow. The houses leaned over one another like nosy neighbours trying to hear gossip. The city was packed with timber buildings, wooden signs, wooden beams, wooden staircases, wooden everything. Basically, if you were a flame, London was not a city. London was a buffet. And somewhere in the dark, down a small street called Pudding Lane, inside a bakery owned by Thomas Farriner, a fire began. At first, it was small, just one building, one bakery, one glow in the darkness. But by the time London fully woke up, that tiny fire had become one of the most famous disasters in English history. This is the story of how a bakery fire turned into the Great Fire of London. And yes, it started in a place called Pudding Lane, which sounds less like the beginning of a disaster and more like the location of a suspiciously cheerful dessert shop. To understand why the fire became so terrible, you have to understand what London was like in 1666. London was crowded, noisy, smelly, busy, and built in a way that made absolutely no sense if you were trying to avoid fire. Many houses were made from timber and plaster. They were packed close together. Some upper floors even stuck out over the street, almost touching the buildings opposite them. So imagine walking down a narrow street where the houses above you are basically leaning in like, "What are you doing? Where are you going? Got any snacks?" There were workshops, warehouses, kitchens, bakeries, stables, candles, open fires, hay, oil, tar, pitch, rope, and wooden barrels. It was like the whole city had looked at fire safety and said, "No thank you, we prefer chaos." And to make things worse, the summer had been dry. The wood was dry. The roofs were dry. The city was ready to burn. All it needed was a spark. The fire began in the bakery of Thomas Farriner, also spelled Farriner in some records, who was a baker to King Charles II. That sounds impressive, doesn't it? Baker to the king. Not just I make bread. More like, I make bread for royalty. Please respect the loaf. Sometime after midnight, around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of September, smoke began filling the bakery. One of the people in the house woke up choking on smoke. The family escaped through an upstairs window into the house next door. But sadly, one maidservant did not escape, and she is often remembered as the first victim of the fire. At that moment, no one knew what was coming. No one looked at the little bakery and thought, "Ah, yes, there goes half the city." They thought it was a house fire, a dangerous house fire. Yes, but still just a house fire. The neighbours did what people usually did when fire broke out. They rushed over with buckets. They shouted. They panicked. They probably formed the most stressed water chain in London. But in 1666, there were no modern fire engines, no flashing lights, no firefighters in helmets jumping out of trucks, no emergency phone number. No one could yell, "Call 000" or "Call 999." Because everyone would just stare and say, "What is a phone? And why are you yelling numbers at me?" Firefighting was basic. People used buckets, hooks, ladders, and fire squirts, which were early hand-pumped water devices. Another common method was to pull down nearby houses to create a gap so the fire couldn't spread. That sounds extreme, but in a city made of wood, sometimes the only way to stop a fire was to destroy the next building before the fire could eat it. The problem was, pulling down houses meant permission, and permission meant delay. And delay was exactly what the fire needed. The Lord Mayor of London at the time was Sir Thomas Bloodworth. He was called to the scene and asked to approve the pulling down of nearby houses. This was the moment when London needed strong, fast leadership. And instead, it got hesitation. Bloodworth was worried about property rights and whether the owners would complain if their buildings were destroyed. Which, to be fair, is a very landlord-heavy thought to have while the city is actively catching fire. It's like standing in front of a burning toaster and saying, "Before we unplug it, has the toaster consented?" According to later accounts, he underestimated the danger. He did not act quickly enough. And while people argued, the flames spread. The fire did not care about paperwork. The fire did not care about rent agreements. The fire did not care whose cousin's uncle technically owned the second floor. It just kept moving. Then came the wind. A strong east wind pushed the flames westward through the city. Sparks flew from roof to roof. Burning bits of wood and ash floated through the air. One house caught fire, then another, then another. It was not just spreading along the street, it was leaping. The fire moved like it had somewhere important to be. And London was full of things that helped it along. Warehouses near the river stored materials like oil, tar, rope, and brandy. These were not exactly fire-resistant. They were more like fire's favourite snacks. So the fire found timber houses, dry roofs, flammable goods, and wind. Basically, every ingredient for disaster had turned up to the same party. And the party was getting out of control. One of the most famous witnesses to the Great Fire was Samuel Pepys, a government official who kept a detailed diary. Thanks to people like Pepys, we have powerful descriptions of what Londoners saw and felt during those terrifying days. Pepys saw the fire spreading and realised this was not a normal blaze. This was enormous. This was dangerous. This was the kind of disaster that makes everyone stop pretending things are fine. And if you've ever seen someone look at a tiny problem and say, "It'll sort itself out," right before it absolutely does not sort itself out, that was London on the first day. At first, some people did not take it seriously enough. Then they saw the sky. Then they saw the smoke. Then they saw entire streets burning. And suddenly, everyone became very, very serious. As the fire spread, thousands of people began fleeing. Families loaded carts with whatever they could carry: chairs, blankets, tools, chests, food, clothes, business records, children, probably one confused chicken that had no idea why Sunday had become so dramatic. Many people rushed toward the River Thames, hoping to escape by boat. The river became crowded with people trying to save their belongings. Imagine the panic, the smoke in your eyes, the heat behind you, the sound of bells ringing, people shouting, horses pulling carts through packed streets, families trying to decide what to save when everything they owned was inside a burning house. Do you grab money, clothes, a Bible, food, your tools, your favourite chair, your suspiciously heavy box labelled "definitely not valuables"? For many Londoners, there was no time to choose carefully. They just ran. The fire began near London Bridge, close to the river, in a part of the city filled with narrow streets and crowded buildings. London Bridge itself had houses and shops built on it, because apparently someone looked at a bridge and thought, you know what this needs? More buildings, also shops, also people living above water. That seems perfectly sensible. Parts of the city near the bridge were in danger, and people feared the flames might cross or spread in even worse ways. But the fire was mainly driven westward by the wind. It pushed deeper into the city of London, burning through neighbourhood after neighbourhood. And still, the question remained, how do you stop a fire this big? Buckets were useless now. This was not a "throw a bucket on it" fire. This was a "the whole street is now an oven" fire. Eventually, King Charles II became personally involved. He and his brother, James, Duke of York, helped organise efforts to stop the fire. By then, the plan was clearer. Create firebreaks. A firebreak is a gap. If you destroy buildings ahead of the flames, the fire has nothing to burn when it reaches that point. It sounds simple, But in a packed city, it meant pulling down homes, shops, and streets before the fire got there. And when pulling buildings down by hand was too slow, gunpowder was used to blow them up. So now London had fire, smoke, panic, and explosions. Honestly, at this point, the city was not so much having a bad day as performing a full disaster orchestra. The king's involvement helped bring more order, but the fire was still enormous. It had already become bigger than anyone imagined. Creating firebreaks was dangerous work. People had to get ahead of the flames, pull buildings down, clear debris, and stop the fire from jumping across. But the fire was fast. The wind kept pushing it forward. Sparks kept flying. Smoke made it hard to see and breathe, and the heat was overwhelming. Streets became tunnels of fire. Church towers burned. Roofs collapsed. Warehouses exploded or burst into flame. People watched parts of London they had known their whole lives disappear in hours. The fire did not just destroy buildings. It destroyed memories, homes, shops, churches, neighborhoods, family businesses, streets where people had grown up, worked, worshipped, bought food, argued with neighbors, and lived their ordinary lives. In just a few days, London was being rewritten by flames. One of the most devastating losses was Old St. Paul's Cathedral. This was not the St. Paul's Cathedral you see in London today with its great dome. The old medieval cathedral stood on the site before the fire. Many people believed St. Paul's might survive because it was made of stone. Some even stored belongings inside, thinking it would be safe. But the cathedral was undergoing repairs, and wooden scaffolding surrounded parts of it. The fire reached it, the scaffolding caught, and the heat became unbearable. Lead from the roof melted, stone cracked. The great cathedral was consumed. The loss of St. Paul's became one of the defining images of the disaster. If even St. Paul's could fall, what hope did ordinary houses have? Londoners watched one of their city's greatest landmarks disappear into smoke. The fire burned for several days. It began on Sunday, the 2nd of September, and continued through Monday and Tuesday with terrifying force. By Wednesday, the wind dropped, and the fire began to weaken. By Thursday, the worst was over, though small fires and flare-ups remained. When it finally ended, the destruction was staggering. Around 13,200 houses were destroyed. 87 parish churches were gone. Old St. Paul's Cathedral was ruined. Major civic buildings were destroyed. The heart of the City of London had been burned, and around 100,000 people were left homeless. That number is hard to imagine. Not just one street, not just one neighborhood, but tens of thousands of people suddenly without homes, food, workplaces, or belongings. The fire was over, but for London, the crisis had only changed shape. After the fire, Londoners gathered in fields, churches outside the burned area, temporary camps, and whatever shelter they could find. Imagine standing there with your family, looking back at the city and realizing your home was gone. Your street was gone. Your business was gone. Maybe even the church where you were baptized, married, or buried, your loved ones was gone. People needed food, shelter, and answers. And when disasters happen, people often look for someone to blame. Rumors spread. Some people blamed foreigners. Some blamed Catholics. Some claimed it was a plot. Fear and anger moved through the city almost as quickly as the flames had. But the fire had most likely begun accidentally in the bakery on Pudding Lane. A spark, a dry city, a strong wind, bad timing, poor planning, delayed decisions. Sometimes history changes, not because of one dramatic villain, but because ordinary mistakes happen in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. The ruins of London must have been shocking. Where busy streets once stood, There were blackened walls and smoking rubble. Chimneys stood without houses around them. Church towers were broken. Markets were gone. Familiar corners were unrecognisable. London had survived plague the year before. In 1665, the Great Plague had brought fear and death to the city. Then, in 1666, fire came. To people at the time, it must have felt like disaster after disaster. But London did not disappear. The city began to rebuild. And rebuilding brought a huge question. Should London be rebuilt exactly the way it had been, or should it be redesigned? Some people imagined grand plans with wide streets, open squares, and elegant layouts. A completely new London. But rebuilding an entire city is complicated. People still owned land. Businesses needed to reopen. Families needed homes. Money was limited. Arguments were many. Because if there is one thing humans love after a disaster, it is a committee. One of the most famous people connected with rebuilding London was Christopher Wren, the architect who would later design the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Several ambitious plans were suggested for reshaping London. But, in the end, the city was mostly rebuilt on its old street pattern. However, important changes did happen. New building rules encouraged safer construction. Brick and stone became far more common than timber. Streets were improved in some areas. Fire prevention became a serious concern. London had learned painfully that a city could not just be a giant pile of wood with people living inside it and hope for the best. The new St. Paul's Cathedral would rise from the ruins of the old one, becoming one of London's most famous landmarks. The fire had destroyed much of medieval London. But out of the ashes, a new London began to take shape. The Great Fire of London is remembered not only because it was destructive, but because it changed the city. It showed the dangers of overcrowding, poor planning, and flammable buildings. It showed how quickly a local accident could become a city-wide catastrophe. It also showed the importance of quick decisions during emergencies. A tiny fire in a bakery became a disaster because London was vulnerable. The buildings were too close. The materials were too flammable. The weather was too dry. The wind was too strong. The response was too slow. History often works like that. A big event is rarely caused by only one thing. It is usually many things stacking up together until one final spark sets it all in motion. And in London, that spark came from Pudding Lane. Again, Pudding Lane. Still sounds like a place where you'd buy custard, not accidentally launch a national disaster. Today, near where the fire began, stands the monument to the Great Fire of London. It is a reminder of the disaster, but also of survival. London burned, but it did not end. The people returned. The city rebuilt. The skyline changed. The memory remained. And that is why, more than 350 years later, we still tell this story. Because it began so simply. A bakery, a spark, a sleeping city, and then 4 days of fire. The Great Fire of London destroyed thousands of homes, ruined churches, changed architecture, and reshaped one of the world's most important cities. It is a story about disaster, but also about rebuilding, about panic, but also endurance, about a city that went up in flames and somehow rose again. So the next time you hear about the Great Fire of London, remember this. It was not just a big fire. It was a chain reaction. It was a warning about crowded cities and dangerous building materials. It was a test of leadership. It was a human tragedy for thousands of ordinary people who lost their homes and livelihoods. And it was a turning point that helped create a safer, stronger London. The fire began in the darkness on Pudding Lane. But its story did not end in ashes. It ended with a city rebuilding itself, brick by brick, street by street, memory by memory. And maybe, somewhere in the middle of all that history, there is also one very important lesson. Never underestimate a bakery. because sometimes the smallest spark can change an entire city. Thanks for watching this whiteboard animation about the Great Fire of London. If you enjoy strange, dramatic, and unforgettable stories from history, make sure to watch the next one, because history is full of moments where one tiny decision, one strange accident, or one very questionable idea changed everything.